There's quite a long line here at the entrance to the crypt, with a lot of people wanting to see the body of St. Clara. It's a very emotional moment for everyone to spend at least a few seconds down here. Passing through the convent of the Poor Clares where St. Clara once stayed. This is the place where they tell us a miracle happened. The Pope had asked Clara to bless the bread here in the oratory, and at the moment she made the sign of the cross, crosses appeared on the bread that was here. This was the dormitory. We have to imagine straw beds, everything very simple, just a few blankets. It was really cold. St. Clara brought light. When she arrives, she will bring light. So St. Clara can end storms. She can make the sky clear up. And how do we ask her for that? Is there a way? Offer eggs to St. Clara and the sky will clear up. Eggs, after all, are a symbol of fertility and hope. Even Pope Francisco has done it. Our special today is an ode to St. Clara. St. Clara, clear these skies, give us steady and favorable winds. These seas, these skies, clear them. St. Clara, give us sun. That's right, St. Clara inspired many poets. Manuel Bandera spoke about her, as we just heard now in his prayer for aviators, and so many others have spoken about St. Clara. Today I'm in Assisi, Perugia, to tell you the story of a very important and special saint who lived very closely with one of the greatest names in the history of Christianity. A saint who was deeply influenced by the values of St. Francis and who had to leave everything behind. Leave her family, her parents' dream of a wealthy marriage, all of that. St. Clare, born Chiara Ofreduccio in 1194, was from Assisi, the same city as St. Francis. She was from a noble family and as a child had to flee Assisi for a few years because of a war between nobles and bourgeois. When she returned, she had her first and overwhelming encounter with the one who was still known simply as Francisco. Chiara Ofreduccio was still a teenager when she met St. Francis, who was not yet a saint but was already considered a living saint. For the first time it was here, right in this place where I am, where today there's this great church. Of course, none of this was here back then, and the two saw each other. And she heard the preaching of Francisco de Assisi and was very impressed and deeply moved by his message of charity and dedication to others. But at that time, it was still the Middle Ages. A 15 or 16-year-old girl like Chiara was at that time should have been getting married or even already married, thinking about having children. But when she got home and told her parents she wanted to devote herself to religion, possibly joining a convent and becoming a nun, her parents refused. They wanted her to marry, follow their expectations, and have children. But Chiara stood up to her parents and decided to follow in the footsteps of St. Francis. To picture the scene, we have to remember that none of this church was here. Only that little chapel in the back, known as the Porziuncola, precisely because it was a small portion, a small place. It was on Palm Sunday that Clara, the girl Clara, came here wanting to get away from her parents, wanting to finally say no to her parents. And do you know who welcomed her here? It was St. Francis himself, who used to come to this place often, who welcomed her and heard from Clara that she wanted to become a nun. It is also said that it was here that St. Francis cut the hair of the young Clara, wanting to show a sign of detachment. as if she had once and for all left that life behind to start a new life as a nun. But Clara's parents didn't make it easy for her. No, they came after her. And then, to make things worse, later Clara's sister Caterina also came to join Saint Francis. But this time, the parents didn't accept it, no. They went there, grabbed Caterina, tied her up, tried to pull her out in every way, tried to take her out, but they couldn't. They tried to get her out of the convent. And Clara kept praying. But then it is said that, as if by a miracle, in the middle of that prayer, Caterina became so heavy that her parents couldn't get her out of there. Caterina not only stayed in the convent, but later became known as Clare of Assisi. And that's how things are, right? Sometime later, much later, already a widow, the mother of Clara and Caterina, the person who created that scene with the father, tying up the girl, dragging her away, trying to take her, ended up joining the convent along with the mother. The people here in Assisi say that Clara, the young Clara, defended the city and protected Assisi twice. But then you might ask, how is that possible? If Clara wasn't a warrior, she didn't go to war. How did she do that? What people say is that when the enemies tried to climb the walls of Assisi, Clara placed a host here in the convent window to protect the city. And because of that, tradition says Assisi was protected and not destroyed. The second time, what is told is that Saint Clara's prayer caused a devastating storm for the enemies. Sister Clara lived most of her life in the convent at the church dedicated to Saint Damian. Going up here through the convent of the Poor Clares where St. Clara stayed. This is the place where they tell us a miracle happened. The Pope had asked Clara to bless the bread here in the oratory, and at the moment she made the sign of the cross, crosses appeared on the bread that was here. This was the dormitory. We have to imagine straw beds, everything very simple, just a few blankets. It was really cold and the poor Clares faced a very harsh winter in here. This is the dining hall. We can't go in because everything here dates back to St. Clara's time. Here we can see the tops of the tables. They're all from the 13th century. Everything is very old. Only the frescoes were made in the 17th century. Because of that, the place is well preserved and we can only observe. You can get a sense of life here, among the poor Clares in the time of St. Clare. St. Clare was greatly inspired by the work of Francis of Assisi. Francis was her teacher. She followed and learned from him. And because of that, she wanted the poor ladies of San Damiano, which was her order, to follow the same values as the future saint. That's why she proposed that the women, the nuns, in fact the poor women who were the nuns of her community, should survive only from their own work and small donations. And look how interesting that is. Clara's rule with ideals of equality, seclusion, continuous prayer, and absolute poverty was approved. Just 2 days before her death. Clara of Assisi died at the age of 59 in the year 1253. Many miracles were attributed to her, both during her life and after her death. She was the founder and leader of the order that, after her death, became known as the Order of Saint Clara. The Order of the Poor Clares already had convents in various parts of Europe. By then, Clara was far more than a disciple of Saint Francis, which was already significant, right? She was canonized 4 years after her death, and soon after, they decided to dedicate a church to her. From up here, I see a wonderful landscape of Assisi with many olive trees, old buildings, an inspiring view in every way. And with this sun on top of it all for us to talk about St. Clara, how inspiring. This basilica here wasn't always dedicated to St. Clara, it was once a church dedicated to St. George. But things change a lot here in Assisi. Religion is very intense. Over the years, churches are built next to or on top of old churches. And, now the Basilica of St. Clare has inside it a chapel of St. George, but it is dedicated to this saint who is so important here for Assisi. Now, I would like to invite you to enter the Basilica of St. Clare with me to make a visit that is very sacred for all the Catholics who come here. We are going to enter the crypt where the body with the mortal remains of St. Clare is. Inside the basilica, the chapel of St. George holds this beautiful crucifix. Painted on wood in Byzantine style from the 12th century, it is a fundamental work of art in the life of St. Francis of Assisi, the mentor of St. Clare. What tradition tells us is that it was in front of this crucifix and through it that Francis communicated with Jesus when he received the request to restore the church. Some details of the painting are also very interesting. Although Jesus has wounded hands and feet, the nails are no longer there. This represents a Christ free from torture and death. In the chapel of the Blessed Sacrament, formerly the chapel of St. Agnes, are buried St. Clare's sister Agnes and other relatives of hers. Going down the stairs, we reach the crypt of the Basilica, where the remains of St. Clare of Assisi are kept. There's quite a long line here at the entrance to the crypt, with many people wanting to see the body of St. Clare. It's a very emotional moment for everyone. It's part of the visit to Assisi to spend a few seconds down here. We have to remember that this was a preservation effort carried out back in the Middle Ages with some care taken over time. And of course, it's not St. Clara's body that we see from the outside. Today, it's a work that uses some materials different from those used back then, with wax preserving the relics inside this body. Here there are also relics of St. Clara and St. Francis, including locks of St. Clara's hair. St. Clara's cord, the famous cord of St. Francis, which represents the simplicity of the Franciscans to this day, and some other clothes worn by these great saints of Assisi. Now, after everything you already know about St. Clara, did you know or do you remember that she is also the patron saint of television? It's a very interesting story, and it's also touching because she was already very old. She wanted to attend Mass no matter what, but she couldn't leave her room, her dormitory in the convent. And she stayed there while the other sisters went to attend Mass. But inside the house, she began to have a vision. Suddenly, the walls disappeared. She began to watch the Mass. She began to see everything happening before her. Later, they understood that it was as if she was already foreseeing the idea of television, which would only come to exist centuries later, more than 700 years later. What St. Clara said is that she could see the altar, she could see the priest, and even hear the liturgical chants during the Mass. It was as if she had an invisible window where everything happened inside her dormitory.